This prisoner only does one thing every day. That is to deliberately approach the prison guard and carefully observe the key to his waist. After returning to the cell, he carefully draws an outline. He can't make any mistakes. Even a small detail has to be drawn dozens of times, just to be able to reproduce the key to the maximum extent. But it's not over yet. After the prison guard checks the room, he will light a match again, then carefully observe the lock of the cell door. Then take a piece of white paper, carefully press it on top, then keep rubbing it back and forth with his hands. In this way, the outline of the lock hole is obtained. But how do you know what it looks like inside? The method is also very simple. Roll up the paper and slowly insert it. Then use a wooden stick to keep moving it back and forth. After 20,000 friction, Mark successfully obtained the depth of the lock hole. But even so, he was not happy at all, because the material for making the key became difficult to iron. The next day, when Mark was taking a shower, he told the prison guard about the situation, hoping to get his help. After thinking for 2.5 minutes, the prison guard suddenly came up with a good idea. But it's very dangerous. In order to be free, Mark can only take risks. So when he was working in the woodwork shop, he took advantage of the prison guard's inattention. He secretly took a few solid sticks and planned to hide them at the bottom of the hot water bottle. But every time he went to work, the prison guard had to check everyone's hot water bottles. First, he kowtowed twice at the pool. Then he poured out the coffee inside. In order to prevent people from bringing more things, it was Mark's turn. The prison guard saw that he was a little too nervous. Then he checked that he was obviously taken care of. Not only did he kowtow a few times, but he also shook the hot water bottle hard. There was no misstep. It turns out that Mark had thought of this step in advance. He stuffed a towel in it. That's how he got away. Now that everything is ready, he began to make the key. Mark is very careful. Even the thorns pulled out by the pliers have to be polished with sandpaper. Then use glue to stick the key ring. Put it in the lampshade to bake to speed up the solidifying of the glue. Finally, he repeated the process of painting. Finally, he made a product that he was more satisfied with. Then Mark, in a nervous mood, put the key in the lock. He held his breath and looked forward to turning the key. When he heard the sound of a click inside, Mark knew he had succeeded. The next second, he opened the prison door and breathed in the free air. But it was far from enough to escape. He had to make all the keys here. So in the future, whenever Mark gets a chance, he would stare at the key on the waist of the prison guard. Then he would remember it in his head. He needs to make dozens of such keys in order to open all the prison doors in the prison. And every time he makes a key, he has to experiment to make sure that the prison plan is flawless. Under the cover of his comrade, the man began to try. He would always wear the wrong knife. It is convenient to modify the scene. But this time, there was an accident. When Mark tried to turn the lock back, he was terrified to find that the key was suddenly stuck. And he just used a little force. He didn't expect the key to be broken into 2 pieces. Mark was scared to death. But just at this time, the crazy comrade issued a warning. Everyone continued to work immediately, and Mark, like an ant on a hot pan, used his fingers to pull the lock. In a critical moment, he hurried from the room to grab a pillow. Mark was like grabbing a life-saving straw. He immediately nodded to the lock. His heart was pounding. His feet were getting closer and closer. Even his comrade was in a hurry to take a big picture. Fortunately, it was the first second before the prison guard arrived. Mark successfully pulled out all the wood chips, but the lock was still exposed outside. After the prison guard left, Mark quickly put down the handle in his hand and ran to the door. He was in a hurry to smash it with his hands, but his hands were about to turn into pig's feet, but there was no movement at all. Mark had no choice but to listen to God. In this way, in a tense moment, he lay in bed piteously and waited for the prison guard to lock the door. However, in face of the sudden lock, the prison guard just looked around and he didn't think much. Mark just took a breath. Now the key is ready. How to open the door from the outside is a difficult problem. His comrade came up with a way. He pulled the string from the opposite side of the cell and let the key into the keyhole. But Mark soon denied his idea. In this way, he couldn't turn the key hard. At this time, George saw the handle in front of him. He suddenly had an idea. He could pull the handle out of the window. This length could just hook the key ring. But how to turn the key? That day, when he was working in the woodwork shop, he saw a wheel on the rocking bed. Suddenly, he had a bold idea. He made a turn with the wood, then he fixed the key on it. Then he just needed to pull it out of the window and align the lock hole. But he turned for a long time. Finally, after several attempts, the man successfully opened the door from the inside. He washed out. But the guard who was in charge of patrolling came. If he was found out, he would die. He just wanted to pull the key out, but he accidentally fell to the ground. Now he was in trouble. If the guard found out tomorrow, all his efforts would be in vain. Mark couldn't accept it. In a hurry, he took out a chewing gum that he couldn't bear to eat, stuffed it in his mouth, and tried his best to chew it. Then he came to the window. He tried his best to stretch the broom as far as possible. It turns out that the top was the chewing gum. Mark wanted to use its elasticity to stick the key on it. It looked like he was about to succeed. When he carefully took back the broom, he didn't expect that he would fall to the ground with the chewing gum. Mark was anxious. His emotions were at the brink of explosion, but he could only adjust his mind. He continued to try his best. Because of the elasticity of the chewing gum, Mark had to fight for a few seconds. Fortunately, after several attempts, he finally picked up the key. He took a deep breath. Now the most difficult problem was solved. The only thing left was to make the key to the back door. But this was no longer a difficult task. That night, Mark secretly made a fake man. After covering the quilt, he and Yu prepared to test the key to the back door. There are several doors from upstairs to downstairs. Although he made all the keys, he had to make sure that each key corresponded to the lock. They didn't wear shoes. They came to the first floor with bare hands and feet. But before they could test the key to the first floor, they heard the footsteps of the guards. They ran back with their legs, but time was tight. They could only come to the storage room at the corner of the first floor. But when they hid in, they found that the lock on the door had been broken. They couldn't close it normally. The man could only hold the screws on it with 2 fingers, but the force was too small. It was hard for him to exert force. He saw that the fat policeman had arrived at the door, but at this time he couldn't hold back his relaxation. Fortunately, Mark found a piece of iron in time. Then he pulled the door back again. They didn't dare to make any sound. They were afraid that the other party would hear it. When the fat policeman came upstairs, they took the opportunity to dig it out. Their experiment was not over yet. In order to meet 100,000 warriors, this kind of adventure is very necessary. Every time they open a door, they would mark it on the corresponding key. At this time, the other party was checking the room. Because the light was too dark, he didn't notice the fake man lying on the bed. When the experiment was completed, the man quickly closed the door and hid in the storage room. At this time, the fat policeman had checked all the rooms. But as he walked, he noticed that there were a few drops of sweat on the ground. He thought that he didn't sweat. Then whose sweat was it? The 2 men in the storage room were trembling. It would be too late if they were found out. Fortunately, the other party looked at the ceiling and thought it was leaking. After wiping it off, they left. They took a deep breath. After quietly closing the door, they went back to the cell. In order to prevent the police from raiding and checking, the man put the key in the toothpaste. Because he slept late last night, he didn't wake up until the alarm clock rang for half an hour. 3 policemen opened the cell door vigorously. After coming in, he didn't say a word. Mark only realized that he was going to die. Faced with the interrogation of the police, he had to keep apologizing, but the policeman was obviously not a fool. He ordered his men to search the room. However, after checking for a while, he didn't find anything unusual. Who knew that at this time, the policeman suddenly stopped his movement in his hand, turned his head, and looked down, and the key parts scattered on the ground. Mark was scared that his heart jumped out of his chest. Then the policeman picked up a piece of shard, but he didn't know what it was for half a day. At this time, Mark remembered a move. He forced a photo into the hole and put it there. He barely cheated the policeman's suspicions. The man wore a scarf over the wooden board and made it into a folding ruler. Then he put a newspaper on the top, Through the gap in the cell door, he passed the newspaper to his neighbor. It drew a route to escape from the prison. After watching it, he knocked on the wall and Mark decided to escape today. After the policeman got off work, Mark took the stick out of the window and opened the prison door skillfully. Then he released his two comrades. They took off their uniforms and took out the disguise they had prepared in advance. They quickly put them on. At the same time, the fat policeman downstairs just blocked the toilet, came to the storeroom to find the pin, and accidentally touched the pin that Mark had prepared in advance. But he didn't think much. At this time, the escape team had already come to the iron gate, but they heard footsteps below and hurried back carefully. Until the footsteps disappeared, they dared to come downstairs. Then they hid in the storage room and prepared to hide here. The man just wanted to use the iron lock to lock the door, but found that he was gone. He had no choice but to choose to hold it again, but because the fat policeman was too very necessary. Every time they open a door, they would